Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace. Alison Devis, though she looked perfectly normal, was a strange little girl. She had a mousy appearance, with dull eyes and hair, as she walked with her head down, watching her little feet scurry below her. Alison never did anything bad, but the locals found her small presence disturbing. Though she kept her distance, whenever her eyes met those of a stranger, the wide and glassy whites of her eyes made the onlooker look away, feeling uneasy and violated. Alison, almost a woman these days, cared not for the discomfort she inflicted on others. If anything, she relished in it. She knew she was powerful, and she knew she always had him at her side. The big black dog, with teeth as sharp as knives and eyes as black as ink. No one could ever hear him snarl or feel his rancid breath against the back of their necks. He only blessed Alison with his presence, and she honoured his friendship. He was her only friend, and only he understood her. Only he saw her potential. John Law was a humble peddler from Halifax, a nearby merchant town. It was evening, and John was exhausted from his day at work. His feet were sore and blistered, and he felt far too old to be lugging such weighty goods along the highway. He usually had the route to himself at this time of day, but as he walked along Cornfield, he came across Alison Devis. Uneager to make small talk, John kept his head down, but Alison called out to him. "Good evening, sir," Alison cried. "I'm in need of some pins. May I ask you for some?" John Law knew of the Devises well enough to know about their status. He'd seen Alison and her sister begging on the streets. There was no chance such a young lady, barely out of childhood, could afford such goods. So John ignored her, keeping his head low, and continued along the highway. Alison, believing he had not heard her, followed and repeated her request. "No," John Law replied, irritated. "My workday is over, and I shall not unload my parcel for such a measly item." "It shan't take long to unpack," Alison retorted, "and I can help you need be." "And how, pray tell, do you plan to pay?" John snorted. "A young woman such as yourself should not be trusted alone on a highway with that amount necessary. Begone, girl." John heaved his pack and pulled away from Alison, who stopped in the street and watched the man dismiss her. "What wouldst thou have me do unto yonder man?" Alison heard the dog whisper. Curious, Alison tilted her head. "What canst thou do at him?" "I can lame him," the dog snarled. Alison looked back at the peddler, struggling with his goods along the highway, dragging his sore feet along the ground, too weak and too tired to lift them up. He was fragile, yet still strong enough to refuse his service to her. Old men should not be so foolish as to underestimate young women. "Lame him," Alison answered. John Law heard the mad young girl muttering something under her breath. How that family was still allowed to roam free was a mystery to him. He merely rolled his eyes at her, muttering, and then John started to feel uneasy. The side of his face went numb, as did his arm, and he dropped some of his packages. Suddenly, John, just a few feet away from Alison, collapsed, of what we now know is a stroke. He survived, and how he got home is unclear. We don't know if Alison helped him or abandoned him there. All we know is that John was classified as lame from that point onwards. He was unable to walk anymore, and he told others that Alison Devis cursed him that day and made him lame. Little did Alison know that day, when she met John Law out on the highway, that it would be the beginning of one of the most famous witch trials in English history. Well, hello everyone and welcome to my library. If you're new here, hello. My name is Chinsia, and if you're not new here and you're one of my lovely regulars, hi, how are you? I hope you're doing splendidly. In today's video, we'll be going into all the details about the legendary 17th century Pendle witch trials, which was documented in an official publication, The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancashire, by the Clerk of the Court, Thomas Potts. Though witch trials during this period were rife, fewer than 500 people in England were ever executed on the charge of being a witch. But in this unusual trial of 1612, we see 12 witches charged, and most of those hanged, meaning that those found guilty made up 12% of those executed for witchcraft in England. So before we get into the very long story, you better get yourself a cup of tea and a snack and sit down because it's intense. I'd like to thank today's video sponsor, Squarespace. Now, as you know, I'm currently building my Lady of the Library website, soon to be launched, and I'm very excited for it. And I've made all of my main business websites over the past few years with Squarespace because I love how intuitive and easy it makes website design and layout. I don't know anything about coding, I hate faffing around, I don't have much time, but with Squarespace, I can simply drag and drop my content where I want it and make a beautiful professional looking site within a few hours. If you're a writer or a creator who wants to expand your revenue stream, then Squarespace is an all-in-one platform that makes it so easy for you to monetize your content and expertise in a way that fits your brand. Squarespace member area lets you sell courses or classes to your followers, and Squarespace also has an inbuilt email campaign option where you can collect email subscribers and convert them to loyal customers, all from your website. If you're interested in following my blog, I'll leave a link down below to sign up to my newsletter. And the built-in analytics feature gives you insight into who's visiting your site, traffic sources, time that's spent on the site, most read content, audience geography, and so much more. So if you want to expand your business or just build a beautiful site for your blogging leisure, then squarespace.com is perfect for you. Go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Lady of the Library to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you so much, Squarespace, for sponsoring today's video, and let's get into the very detailed Pendle witch trials. So a lot of the history about witches in England actually takes us back to Scotland and King James I, but I'd actually like us to do a whole separate video on that system entirely because I believe it deserves it. So for today, we are just focusing on the details of this case, and we'll look into the witch trials and the laws that were established by King James I of Scotland in another video. For now, all we need to know is that during this time, King James, who had penned a book in 1603 called Demonology, had instructed readers to condemn and prosecute both supporters and practitioners of witchcraft. Though Alison Devis and her supposed curse was the trigger for these trials, the history of those involved goes way back and was quite well established in the local area. These witch trials focused on two families of cunning folk, the Demdike family and the Chateau family, both headed by old poverty-stricken widows, Elizabeth Southerns, aka Old Demdike or Mother Demdike, and Anne Whittle, aka Mother Chateau. Old Demdike had been known as a witch for 50 years in the village, as during the 16th century there were village healers who practiced magic and dealt in herbs and medicines. At the beginning of the year this incident with Alison Devis took place, 1612, each justice of the peace in Lancashire were instructed to compile a list of all those who refused to attend church or take communion, which was criminal offence back then. The location of the story, Lancashire, is of note. At the time, Lancashire, largely due to the area's general sympathy to the Catholic Church, had been regarded as a wild and lawless society. The area manifested disputes ranging from government regulation in the provinces to popular scepticism and religious difference. During the dissolution of the monasteries, you know, that thing that happened when King Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, the people of Pendle Hill openly opposed the closure of the nearby Cistercian abbey and reverted straight back to Catholicism when Queen Mary came to the throne in 1553. Later, in 1612, James I famously issued the Declaration of Sports as a response to Lancashire's excessive revelry on the Sabbath, which had been a common complaint from bishops in the area since as early as the 1570s. So let's return to John Law and Alison Devis. Alison was the granddaughter of Old Demdike, whose family tree I'll pop up on the screen here. Old Demdike had 2 children, Elizabeth and Christopher, and Elizabeth went on to have 3 children herself, Alison, James and Jeanette. Alison admitted her part in the cursing of John Law and begged to be forgiven, and John Law apparently granted her forgiveness. Now, most documentation claims that John Law's son, Abraham, took the matter to Roger Knoll, the local magistrate. However, whilst researching, I came across a bit of a hiccup. I found a claim by a man called David Penny, documented by another chap called John Clayton, that stated that the commonly held view that Roger Knoll instigated the Pendle Witch Roundup is incorrect. However, in the article they gave no further details to this. They didn't express any counter-evidence or offer an alternative that I could access online. Instead, Clayton advertised his book, The Pendle Witch 4th Century Handbook, which is currently on sale for a whopping £150, which is nearly 3 times the amount of money that this video will make, so I obviously couldn't access it and didn't want to at that cost. So it's something to keep in mind, but I should stress that I couldn't find anyone else discussing this discrepancy on Roger Knoll. All I know is that in The Wonderful Discovery of Witches to the County of Lancashire, the book written by the Clerk of the Court, Thomas Potts, there's a section on page 286 called The Examination of Abraham, i.e. John Law's son, and that is written by Roger Knoll. So I don't know why Roger's influence has been disputed elsewhere, but we'll proceed with Roger fulfilling his role that everyone else says that he fulfills. So, it's documented that Abraham Law came to Roger Knoll on March 30th, 1612, and retold his father's story about Alison Devis to the magistrate, with a slight twist. Instead of explaining that John Law refused Alison the pins, he claimed his father actually gave them to her. A lie which justified to the magistrate Abraham's anger with Alison for withholding a supposed cure to his father's stroke. Alison had admitted to witchcraft, but the refusal of the pins gave some justification to her case. However, Abraham spun the story, and in this storyline, in which John Law had given her what she desired, she had no motive for cursing him, and thus her witchcraft was classified as needless malice. Roger Knoll summoned Alison for questioning that same day, where she recounted her tale of events, including the role of her familiar, the black dog. She owned up to the curse, but her confession opened up far more rabbit holes than potentially Knoll was expecting. Knoll wanted to know more about this black dog, so Alison told him that he was a spirit to whom she had sold her soul to 2 years prior for, quote, the power to do anything she would, all under the guide of her grandmother, Old Demdike. You see, Old Demdike told Alison that she should let the devil or a familiar appear to her and let it suck on some part of her in exchange for power. Terrified of the consequences of her confession, Alison denounced the familiar and blamed her grandmother for her corruption. Old Demdike was blind in her elderly age and thus relied heavily on Alison for getting around. Alison told Roger that her grandmother was a powerful witch whose magic she'd seen in action. She told Roger how Old Demdike often cursed their neighbours' cattle and once turned a pail of milk into butter without touching it. However, she also had dark powers which she enacted on one neighbour, Richard Baldwin. Richard had ordered old Demdike to get off his land, and furious at his rudeness and audaciousness, old Demdike made Alison take her out in the middle of the night to perform a ritual under the shadow of darkness. The next day, Richard's daughter fell ill and died within a year. Why Alison decided to confess this much detail to a magistrate is unknown. She may have been frightened, or she may have felt bold, thinking that disclosing such powers would frighten the magistrate into leaving them alone. All we know is that once Alison started talking, she didn't stop, and that's when she brought another witch family into the mix, the Chateau family. Okay, so this is a little confusing as well. So here's a family tree of the Chateau family. As you can see, none of their surnames are Chateau. We have Old Chateau, who's actually Anne Whittle, and her two daughters, Elizabeth Whittle, also known as Bessie and Anne, and then her granddaughter Mary. Anne Whittle, also known as Old Chateau, was an elderly witch and a rival to Old Demdike. The families have been feuding for years, ever since one of the Chateau family members broke into the Malkin Tower, the home of the Demdikes, and stole grain meal and linen to the value of £1, which is approximately £100 now. Despite his powerful mother-in-law, John Devis, Alison's father, was too afraid to take the matter further. Instead, he seems to have cut a deal with Old Chateau, giving her an annual tribute of grain meal in exchange for leaving them the hell alone. However, it was not long before John Devis stopped paying the tribute and fell ill, and then on his deathbed he blamed Old Chateau for his demise. Needless to say, it would seem that Alison saw the opportunity to take revenge for her father's death by dragging the Chateau family down with her. Alison told Roger of what happened to her father and also accused Old Chateau of killing a friend of hers, Anne Nutter, because she laughed at the old woman. She also accused Chateau of bewitching to death a farmer, Hugh Moore, who accused Chateau of killing one of his cows with her magic. Chateau had also targeted John Moore, a local gentleman from nearby Higham. Mr. Moore had accused Chateau of bewitching his drink, and in response to his accusation, Chateau had said that she would meet or get even with the said John Moore, or his. Chateau then made a clay image of John Moore's child, who promptly fell ill and died 6 months later. Alison's confessions gave Roger Nowell all the evidence he needed to conclude that there was a dangerous nest of witches in his jurisdiction, and so on April the 2nd he and Alison travelled to the southeast end of the Pendle Hill to interview the old witches at the house of the local gentleman, James Wilsey. The old witches proudly admitted to practising witchcraft, and their stories were very similar. Mother Demdike, like her granddaughter, had made a pact with a familiar called Tib when she turned 60, which was 20 years prior to this moment, and Chateau had connected with her familiar, Fancy, 5 years later. However, both witches had familiars who were in the shape of young men rather than dogs, and these young men did their bidding in exchange for their souls. Both the witches apparently needed some convincing to give up their souls. Old Demdike put off the offer for 6 years, but both of them gave in due to old age. You see, both Old Demdike and Chateau were frail and powerless. Their families faced poverty and they were mocked and ill-treated by their neighbours. So a familiar's help was, somewhat needed. They assured Roger that they only ever harmed those who did harm unto them. Richard Baldwin's daughter died, Old Demdike explained, as a punishment for him not paying her daughter Elizabeth for the work that she'd done for him. She told Roger how she and Elizabeth had tried many times to collect payment, but he abused them, and so she released her little Tib on him. Old Chateau also confirmed the story of bewitching Farmer Moore's cows, but she did that because he had favoured Old Demdike to her, and she resented him for it. She also admitted to killing a Nutter, not Anne Nutter, Alison's friend, but Robert Nutter. Chateau explained that Robert Nutter tried to have his way with her married daughter, Anne Redfern. When Anne rejected Robert Nutter's advances, he threatened to have her family evicted once he inherited the land from his grandfather. So, Chateau set fancy on him. However, Robert Nutter was so disliked that apparently his grandmother had come to both Chateau and Old Demdike and asked them to punish him by wanting him dead. So really, they were just doing a local service. Now, what's important here, and what's important for the rest of the story and where this all unravels, is that Old Demdike and Old Chateau made magic combining folk magic and Roman Catholic prayers. Old Demdike also described how she made a clay model of her victims, or a picture of clay, which she used to focus her power on. She would dry the clay model out and then would drive a pin or thorn in the place where she wanted to cause illness. When she wanted any part of their body to consume away, she broke off that part of the image and burnt it. And then if she wanted to kill someone, she burned the whole figurine. Another victim of Old Chateau was a cow belonging to a man called John Nutter. There are a lot of Nutters in this story, so prepare yourself. And yes, the Nutter family was clearly heavily disliked. Anyway, to take revenge on John Nutter via his cow, Old Chateau performed a charm over a pail of milk from that cow, with 2 sticks across it. Chateau's charm featured a combination of sympathetic magic and Christian prayer, and it went as such. 3 biters hast thou bitten, the heart, ill eye, ill tongue. 3 bitter shall thou boot, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost of God's name. 5 paternosters, 5 aves, and a creed, in worship of 5 wounds of our Lord. Fancy then went on and bit the brown cow, who apparently then went mad and died 6 weeks later. The 2 witches confessed to even more than that, but Noel had had enough to make his arrests, and so Alison, Old Chateau and Old Mother Demdike, and Chateau's daughter Anne Redfern were arrested that day and taken to Lancaster Castle. Then, later that month, whilst the 4 women awaited their trial, Roger Noel received news of a secret meeting that took place on April 10th, which was Good Friday, at Malkin Tower, where the Devises lived. Technically, for all we know, the meeting could have been an innocent gathering of neighbours and friends, comforting the Devises for the arrest of their family members. But, suspicious of the date, Roger didn't want to take any chances. You see, why would good people be gathering at a house of a known witch instead of a church on Good Friday? It didn't make sense. So, Noel summoned James Devis, Elizabeth's teenage son and Alison's brother, on the 27th of April to interrogate him about the meeting. James admitted that on Good Friday, there had been a gathering not of sympathetic neighbours, but a grand convocation of 17 witches and 3 wizards, to whom he served lamb, which he'd stolen. They had come, James explained, to name Alison's familiar whilst she was away in prison, and to seek vengeance for a witch from Gisborne, a nearby town. This witch, Jeanette Preston, had recently been acquitted of a charge of witchcraft in York Castle. However, she wished her accuser, Thomas Lister, to suffer and called upon the convocation to aid her. Additionally, the convocation of witches and wizards had come with the intention to blow up Lancaster Castle to rescue the incarcerated witches. Besides himself and his mother, the other witches of the convocation were, quote, the wife of Hugh Hargreaves of Barley, the wife of Christopher Bullock of the Moss End, and John, her son, the mother of Miles Nutter, Elizabeth, the wife of Christopher Hargreaves of Thorneyholme, Christopher Howgate and Elizabeth his wife, Alice Gray of Colne, and one Moldheel's wife. Roger also asked Jeanette, James and Alison's little sister, about the events of Good Friday, and this little girl confirmed the gathering of the witches. However, she could only name 6 witches present, and none of the names matched up with those her brother listed. She named, quote, the wife of Hugh Hargreaves of Pendle, Christopher Howgate of Pendle, uncle to her, and Elizabeth his wife, and Dick Miles his wife of Roughly, Christopher Jacks of Thorneyholme and his wife. Though Jeanette gave a different list, only some of those on James' list were arrested and none of hers. Those arrested on James' list were John and Jane Bulcock and Catherine Hewitt, who's also known as Mould Heels. But trust me, they weren't the last to be arrested. James also admitted to being involved in witchcraft. Like his relatives, he had resisted the call until he felt so dire about his fortunes and prospects that he wanted to assert some power and take revenge on those who had wronged him and his family. During his admission, he implicated his mother by revealing that she too made clay puppets of her enemies and had a familiar called Ball who took the form of a brown dog. He soon joined his mother, grandmother and sister in Lancaster Castle's Well Tower dungeon. Soon there were 9 accused witches stuffed within one cell, without any ventilation or sanitation. This was too much for old Demdike, and in May she died before her trial could even begin. On May the 19th, Old Chateau decided to denounce more witches. Why, we don't know. Perhaps she was hoping for some salvation of sorts after witnessing old Demdike die in prison, but she would be sadly mistaken. Old Chateau claimed that Margaret Pearson of Padiham had been a witch, and she also denounced Jeanette Preston, that witch who was acquitted from York Castle, by saying that Jeanette actually killed her employer. This accusation saw Jeanette Preston re-arrested and put on trial for witchcraft for the 2nd time that year. Margaret Pearson then joined the witches in the Wells Tower, as did another woman, Isabel Roby. Now, the witches had to wait 5 months for their trial because trials could only occur when a judge visited the town as part of their circuit, and Lancaster was only visited twice a year. When the trial started on the August 18th, 1612, Jeanette Preston, thanks to Old Chateau's accusation, had been found guilty of witchcraft in York and hanged. Jeanette Preston had a long-standing feud with Thomas Lister, who was that man who ended up prosecuting her the first time in 1612. You see, Thomas Lister's father was Jeanette Preston's employer, and she was very possibly his mistress. When his father died, Thomas Lister believed that Jeanette Preston caused his death, so he sent her to get trialed for witchcraft, but then she was acquitted. However, when Chateau, a fellow witch, accused Jeanette of killing her employer, that was all the proof Lister needed to take Jeanette back to court and all the way to be hanged. So, here's the remaining witches. The first day of the trials focused on prosecuting Old Chateau, Elizabeth Devis and her son, James Devis. However, James had actually tried to kill himself in prison, and he was so severely injured that he wasn't physically able to stand his trial, so they had to hold him up the entire time. Old Chateau pled not guilty to the murder of John Nutter, and Elizabeth Devis pled not guilty to the murders of James and John Robinson, but all 3 were charged with murder. You see, the real kicker for Elizabeth was that her 9-year-old daughter, Jeanette, testified against her mother, her brother, and eventually her sister as well. Jeanette told the court that she had seen her mother's familiar, Ball, kill various members of the community, and that she'd witnessed the gathering of the witches at Malkin Tower, and overheard the plots to blow up Lancaster Castle. She told them how she saw witches riding horses and flying off on them, and she said that her brother James had been a witch for 3 years before she actually witnessed him kill other people. Jeanette, some historians say, was a resentful child. You know, she knew that she was actually an illegitimate child with an unknown father, and she was sort of treated as the runt of the litter, and for that, she was isolated and different. No one knows how she felt as she watched her mother scream in anger against her in court so violently that they had to remove Elizabeth from the room, but she may have been feeling a little smug. The next day, Anne Redfern, Alice Nutter, Catherine Hewitt, Jane and John Bulcock, Alison Devis, Isabel Roby and Margaret Pearson were put on trial. Alison was the only one of the 11 witches who pled guilty, but the rest were all condemned once again by the testimony of Alison's little sister, Jeanette. Once again, the court had absolutely no evidence aside from testimony. Anne Redfern was found guilty based solely on James Devis's testimony, in which he claimed he saw Anne make a clay model of Robert Nutter's father, Christopher Nutter. Alice Nutter was an anomaly in this trial. You see, she was a member of a landed gentry, but she came from a staunch Catholic family. And this is where the Catholicism in the prayer and the chanting and the charms come in. Though there was no evidence or even hearsay about Alice Nutter doing any witchcraft, convicting her of witchcraft was a useful deterrent and sent a strong message to other Catholics out there, whom Roger Nowell had been ordered to compile a list of at the beginning of 1612. The rest of the witches were condemned solely on Jeanette's testimony, and she was taken seriously because she was, 1, willing to testify against her own family, but 2, she didn't have any connections to witchcraft, and 3, she was young and innocent. Why wouldn't they believe her? In an ironic turn of events, Jeanette would also be arrested on suspicion of witchcraft 20 years later, in November 1633, when another ironic little boy, this one called Edmund Robinson, would accuse her and 16 others of witchcraft. Jeanette would be accused of murdering Isabel, the wife of William Nutter. I know, another Nutter. But in Jeanette's case, she's actually acquitted. She was only allowed to leave Lancaster Castle after she paid in full for her board at the time she spent there during her trial. However, the last known record we have of Jeanette Devis was in 1636. After that, we don't know what happened to her. Anyway, back to 1612. Alice Nutter, Catherine Hewitt, who's also known as Maud Heel, and John and Jane Bulcock had been named by James as attendees of the witch gathering on Good Friday, and they were also accused of other crimes by James. Alice Nutter, James claimed, helped old Demdike murder Henry Mitten. Catherine Hewitt, he argued, killed a child, and Anne Folds and the Bulcocks bewitched a woman into madness and then death. Once again, this was all hearsay, and they were condemned further by Jeanette. Now, as we know, Jeanette gave completely different names to her brother James, about the witches who gathered on Good Friday. However, despite all of that, and despite not naming any of the people that were there in court, Jeanette identified them all in court as having been present, and thus all 4 were found guilty. Then we have the 2 random endings, Margaret Pearson and the stray Isabel Roby, who were then put on trial. Isabel Roby was accused of witchcraft by her goddaughter's partner, Peter Chaddock, who alleged that his physical discomforts were caused by her, and apparently she struck terror into all of the neighbours. Really, it kind of sounded like an elderly woman who spoke her mind and wasn't fond of him and made it known. Her greatest crime was begging for milk and checking in regularly with her goddaughter for whom she was worried about. You see, a woman called Jane Wilkinson claimed that she felt sick and pinching pains in her fingers and her thumbs after having refused to give Isabel any milk for which she was begging. And Margaret Leon, the wife of Thomas Leon and the younger of Windle, said that she'd heard Isabel Roby boasting that Peter Chaddock would never recover until he begged her for forgiveness. And on that testimony, she was found guilty. Margaret Pearson was charged with riding a horse to death, But as this was the only accusation against her, and because the court was clearly only interested in crimes that affected people and not animals, Margaret was found guilty of non-capital witchcraft and was the only one to escape execution. Instead, she was pilloried in Lancaster for 4 market days and then served a year in prison. The next day, 10 of the original 12 accused Pendle witches were hanged. 5 of them had admitted to their witchcraft, but the rest were all charged on hearsay. There was no evidence for any of their crimes, but 5 very proudly gave themselves in. They were punished for personal and political agendas. As you can tell from the relation between Catholicism and witchcraft, those in the era of James I and the Protestant Church found opportunities to punish and marginalise Catholics and those who chose to stay loyal to their original religion. But then they were also marginalised people. They had little money and power, they were elderly and frail, and thus they were very easy targets. No one would stand up for them, not even their relatives. And so they were made a mockery of and hanged on the basis of being different. And so ends the very long tale of the Pendle witches. I hope you found this enjoyable. As you can tell, it's quite a lengthy process, but we'll go into more of the laws of England's witchcraft, and then we'll explore witchcraft across the world, because I am very fond of discussing the witchcraft history. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you, Squarespace, for sponsoring today's video, and thank you for listening all the way through and watching it. Please consider liking and subscribing if you have not done already, and I will see you soon for another video. And remember, books save lives, so keep reading.